it feels kind of strange coming up to Scotland, which historically has got a reputation for having been home to first-class education, and in many respects a pioneer of the Enlightenment and intellectual thought. And when I look at Scotland today, it looks familiar because it's not unlike England or other parts of Europe or North America, except all the pedagogical and intellectual problems tend to have a more entrenched and profound character. It's almost as if this has become a unique laboratory of how you can unravel the educational process, how you can unravel the project of intellectually stimulating young people, inspiring them and guiding them. And that, I think, is really quite important to understand. I don't want to talk very much about Scotland because I think the issues at stake are generic and they pertain to all the Western societies, unfortunately, at the moment, to a greater or lesser extent. But I just want to make one observation, which is, if I'd been giving this speech 15 years ago, I would have just confined my talk to a discussion as to why are educational standards lowering. Why is it that our children or your grandchildren are learning less in school than we did in virtually every single subject? And it's, as a father, I was shocked to look at my son's English curriculum and realize that was reading about 20% of what I was expected to engage with when I went to school in Canada. And that kind of realization that the intellectual academic content of education has become so thin was something that was bothering me very much being a university academic. You expect that schools produce kids ready for university, and in my discipline in sociology, we have to put on an extra course for kids coming to university to teach them things that in the previous year a 13-year-old would have known, like what is the Industrial Revolution? What's the difference between a peasant society and an industrial society? We put on discussions on this at university, recognizing that you can no longer take for granted that young kids come to university prepared to engage with more complex ideas and be prepared to be intellectually stretched. Now, it seems to me that education in virtually any society has got to involve an attempt to inspire people, to educate young people for freedom. A good educator is concerned with making sure that the students that are taught in their school are able to acquire a degree of intellectual independence when they leave that school, can begin to think for themselves, and have a degree of confidence about their place in the world that is based upon their understanding of where they come from, what kind of society they come from, what kind of community they come from, what is the background to their life. And therefore education, no matter what kind of pedagogy you're talking about, always involves an attempt to conserve. You're kind of conserving the legacy of the past. You're kind of looking at what the past has offered society. And what you're doing in the whole process is you're transmitting to the young generations the values and the insights and the intellectual achievements of the previous generations. So generational continuity with what has gone on before is really quite important, not because you just simply want to say that everything that comes from the past is good, but nevertheless what you want to say is that we have to understand our origins. Because if we don't have our origins, if we somehow have become detached from our past, it's inevitable that younger generations will lose their way in the future, in a sense, not be clear where they're going to, what kind of direction. And I think today what has happened, and this I think is the background to some of the disputes we're having here, is that at a certain point in the United Kingdom, schools have rejected, either explicitly or implicitly, the legacy of the past. And indeed, they look upon the past as almost as if it was the bad old days. Now we're modern, now we're sensitive, now we're enlightened, or to use their language, now we're aware, whereas the previous generations were thick, insensitive, lacking in empathy, possibly xenophobic or homophobic or racist. And therefore, given the fact that these people were so backward, there really is very little point in connecting our ways, our understanding of the world to what has gone on beforehand. And very often the way that the past is regarded begins by saying that the legacy of what has gone on beforehand is principally outdated. So very often they talk about outdated ideas. And the notion of outdated ideas can be anything from Euclidean geometry to the literary achievements of John Donne, or the philosophical insight of someone like Hume or Smith in the Scottish case, because all of them apparently have some kind of blemished sort of record in relation to this. And pedagogy, in the way that it's learned by teachers in teachers training, is underpinned by this idea of what I call rapid acceleration. Basically, the argument is, and you probably heard this, most educational documents begin with the phrase, "We live in a rapidly changing world." Have you heard that? Yeah. And this seems to be the mantra. We live in a rapidly changing world. And the world has never changed as fast as it does now. And the more you repeat this kind of intense sense of change, the more you draw the conclusion that if the world changes so much, what's the point in teaching people about what has gone on beforehand? Because by the time the children would have learned mathematics or English or historical or other scientific facts, it will be outdated by the time they graduate. So therefore, in the Anglo-American educational system, the conclusion is drawn that it's almost pointless to teach kids academic content, academic subjects. Instead, what we do, and this was the brilliant insight of this Western pedagogy, instead of teaching them academic subjects, we teach them skills. People skills, generic skills. Instead of teaching kids love of reading, we teach them literary skills, and that's very, very different. Because if all you learn is literary skills, you're not going to be able to absorb yourself into the poem. You're not going to be able to absorb yourself into the book, because that requires you kind of spontaneously interacting and learn to love literature. And therefore, it's not surprising that we have a reading crisis. I mean, just as an aside, I've done a lot of research into reading, and I always remember that the first place in the world where there was universal reading was in Denmark. And the reason why the Danish all learned to read wasn't because they went to school and they had wonderful pedagogy. It was simply because the Lutheran Church declared that you have to teach your child how to read the Bible. And therefore, even peasants and ordinary people took it upon themselves to teach their kids how to read. Now, pause for a second. If ordinary people who have no real schooling education could teach their kids how to read, right? I'm going back to the 16th, 17th century. How come that in the 21st century, teachers with PhDs in pedagogy are struggling and are complaining about how difficult it is? And we have dyslexia all over. I mean, the excuses we have about reading is just phenomenal. Apparently, Danish peasants do not have dyslexia or any of the variety of different reading diseases that have been manufactured and conjured up in the more recent period. So anyways, the point I'm really getting at is that if you have this understanding of change and you renounce the past and you focus on skills, you do end up robbing young people of a real education. And you do end up consigning them to essentially second grade and all. Unfortunately, there are some really good teachers, I call them subversive teachers, who kick up against this, and they know that their job is not to teach literary skills but a love of reading. But by and large, the educational system is very inhospitable to teachers who take their job seriously, who regard it as a vocation, rather as a kind of passing phase into something a little bit different. Now, one of the consequences, and this is what I really want to discuss today, one of the consequences of this shift from transmitting ideas to kind of living in the ever-present is you basically at a certain point give up, self-consciously give up on the project of transmitting the past to young people. Now when you essentially draw the conclusion that it's worthless or useless to transmit the past to young people, you eventually get to the point where in a sense you begin to say, well, what are we going to give them? How are we going to socialize them? What kind of values do you want your children to live by? What kind of sort of moral message you want to convey to young people about what is right and what is wrong? What are the guidelines that you want to sort of project to them? And this is where we kind of begin to run into a problem, because increasingly, as you begin to give up on the transmission of values, then you also abandon the project of socializing children into the values that your parents believed in, your grandparents believed in, your community saw as being defining. So, whereas, sort of older generations would have learned about the value of courage, of honesty, of solidarity, of charity. I mean, all the Greek virtues, for example, that would have been like an everyday normal thing for kids to be acquainted with. Current pedagogy finds those values old-fashioned, right, and in a sense quite insensitive to their needs. And what happens is that as a result of that, pedagogy alters its character. What does that mean? Basically, it very simply means that historically, the teaching profession was informed by two disciplines. The first discipline was philosophy. Good teachers learn philosophical thinking as part and parcel of their teacher training. And the second element was theology. So theology and philosophy were quite essential in a sort of integral element of the teaching profession. Now those two disciplines were sidelined, marginalized in teacher training, and they became displaced by one discipline alone, and that was psychology. So essentially from the early 20th century, psychology became increasingly the principal medium through which teachers learned about their job, and that's the point at which teaching became a skill. So you learned about classroom skills, you learned about all these different tricks that you had to adopt in order to be an effective teacher. And you abandoned the idea that a good teacher gains the attention of the class, not by being very funny in the way that they're expected to be now. You gain the attention of the class by being authoritative and knowing your discipline, your own subject. And being a good mathematician, being a good historian and physicist was the way you began to draw young people out and learn to engage with them. And one of the problems is this, and I think it's the principal problem. I talk about it a lot in my book, 100 Years of Identity Crisis, that at a certain point, socialization of young people into a system of coherent values, into a moral outlook, was displaced by psychology. And when psychology becomes the medium through which socialization is carried out, it becomes simply a question of paying attention to young people's emotional state. You became increasingly interested not in what they do, not what they kind of physically or intellectually do, but how they feel. And when psychology takes over the socialization process, both inside and outside the classroom, what it principally does is to validate young people. If there's a word that I hate more than any other word in the English language, it's validate. I don't know if you use that in Scotland, but we use it a lot in England. We're basically validating anything that moves. And what validation means, essentially, is not taking people seriously because you're not interested in their strengths and their weaknesses. You give them automatic respect, you make them feel good about themselves, and in particular, you begin to focus on one thing and one thing alone, which is to raise children's self-esteem. That's another weird expression, because if you're a teacher in this room, if you know young people, you know you cannot raise anybody's self-esteem. It's not like, oh yeah, I'm raising your self-esteem. It's not something that you can do metaphorically, physically, or by any kind of trick. People's sense of themselves depends on what they've done, what they think they've achieved, rather than because they've given lots of smiley faces by a teacher. I don't know if you're giving smiley faces out in Scotland. In England, my son used to come home with sometimes 50, 55 smiley faces. And if I was to believe what the teacher said about my extremely lazy, distracted son, you think that he was Einstein, on the verge of coming up with a theory that was akin to the theory of relativity. That was just constant praise, constant validation became the way. And people think that's a really good idea. We're being empathic, showing empathy for people, being sensitive. But of course, we know that if you give respect on demand, it's anything but sensitive. It becomes an entirely perfunctory act that's got no real moral content, no real meaning, and is attached to that. So what you then end up with is a kind of socialization, which essentially at a certain point also becomes social engineering, but I'll talk about that in a second. And in a sense, when psychology kicks in, four things occur which have a very corrosive effect upon the educational system. The validation process forces young people to focus on their inner life rather than their external life. So as a result of that, they become unnecessarily focused on themselves. And as the classroom experience is framed for a psychological language, they very quickly, at a very early age, embrace it. So they talk about being traumatized, I'm stressed out. When your kid comes home from school, he sounds like a little Freud, talking about depression and various other afflictions. So that's what you learn in school. And that becomes, in a sense, an unhelpful way, because if young people become too inward-looking, then it does become the precondition for being confused and disoriented, which, as it happens, is not given a mental health label. Everything is given a mental health label in our society. As you become inward-looking, the child, and as you're being validated automatically, what also happens is you become infantilized. So children are being treated childishly. And that's not a good thing. You want children to be taken seriously as potential human beings with the capacity to make their way in the world and to contribute to our society, not treated in the, as an ever-present child who will always be childish. And that I think you see very often when you meet even teenagers. I meet young students, first-year students in university, and don't think of themselves as young men or young women, but they think of themselves as girls and boys. And what you have as a result is that biologically mature people still think of themselves as if they were kids, children. So that infantilization process is not particularly good. And what's linked to this, almost, is that we actually disempower children. Because what the psychological process does by making people so inward-looking is it takes away their capacity to look at the world outside of them, to see what they can do to help other people, to see, sort of how they can make a contribution to a wider society, and become increasingly just simply oriented on themselves. And it's not their fault. We often talk about how narcissism and various afflictions are widespread. It's not the children's fault, not young people's fault. It's how they're educated to become. It's the adult world that has really given up on this responsibility to take them seriously. So, in a sense, we got this problem, the disempowering of young people, but then there's another problem. And the other problem is that as this generation of children grows, and I'm talking about the 60s, 70s, 80s, as this generation of people who've been educated in this kind of way make their way in the world, and they now become their own society, they also become, to some extent, unable to understand the distinction between themselves and young people. So one of the things that I find troubling is that the educational establishment and the political establishment of British societies very often looks upon young people as a younger version of themselves. It is as if the line between children and adults gets gradually eroded. And increasingly what we see is that the adult world tries to fix the problems of society through schools. So schools are meant to be the place where you have equality. Nurseries are meant to be the place where you begin to tackle racism. Toddlers are told that it's your job to take seriously the need to be sensitive to the needs of different genders, because unless we do it at the age of 6, the problem will continue. We end up, sort of imagining that the sexual problems of adults already exist amongst the young. So we, as a result, have situations where 4 or 5-year-old children in nurseries are criticized for sexual harassment, as if they even have any idea of either what sexual is or harassment is. You have a situation where we see adult motives, and we discover them amongst very, very young children. And this erosion of the boundary between adults and children is very interesting, because British society always said it's very sensitive to the needs of children. It always proclaims the fact that we protect children. That's our #1 priority. We always talk about the vulnerable child, which is another expression that I hate, because children need not be vulnerable. They are capable of tremendous resilience. But what we do, by trying to fix the problem of society to young kids, is we both infantilize them, but also adultify them. That's the strange paradox. At the same time that we kind of treat them childishly, we sexualize them. At the same time that we treat them childishly, we have the kind of discussions with them about social problems that is totally inappropriate at that particular age. We have the kind of sex education programs, and when you read through it, you kind of wonder what's going through their minds. Why don't you let the children be children? They're not going to be, sort of able to comprehend these kinds of subtle, intimate ideas that even adults are struggling with. Why do you want the kids to have to engage with problems like that? And in a sense, what this does is that a certain social engineering agenda kicks in and comes into place, which overtakes the imperatives of education. And this, I think, is the present moment that we're in. Because it's one thing not to take the past seriously. It's another thing to not to be able to engage and carry out the imperative of socialization. And those things are, I think, are big problems. But then when you get to that point at which education, or the project of education, becomes subject to the social engineering ambitions of adult societies, who are trying to fix the problems of the world through the medium of childhood, then what you end up is something that is really troubling. Because at that point, it's at that point that gradually needs of education, in the way that we understand it, gradually give way to the demands of what is in fact indoctrination. And therefore, when people talk about the classroom becoming subject to the indoctrination, it's not that people have self-consciously set out to indoctrinate children. It's just that they've embraced this view of the relationship between adults and children. They basically bought into the idea that society can only function and can only be improved if we colonize the classroom and turn the classrooms essentially into a space where these political issues are discussed, where we essentially ensure that children adopt our values, no matter what the values of their parents are. And I think gradually what social engineering does is it squeezes out the last vestiges of a creative educational project. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that, because when you begin to imagine that imposing a certain set of values upon the classroom is your mission, is more important than anything else, then something very corrosive occurs. I always remember this when it first hit me, it was even before I wrote my book on education, or just about as I was reading it, and I was talking to a bunch of kids that were living in my street, who would occasionally come over to me to borrow books. I don't know why they did that. I don't think they ever read them. But I think they wanted to impress their parents, coming over to friends to borrow books. So anyways, one day, they kind of brought me to their geography lessons, and they were having a geography exam. And I looked at the textbook, and I realized that this wasn't the geography that I learned when I was in school. Because, call me old-fashioned, when I was a young kid, geography was about learning about rivers and mountains and maps and knowing all the capital cities of the world. It was knowing about the mineral and other kind of resources of different kind of societies. And I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot about the world, about who were the grain producers, where it was still produced, what was the longest river in the world, all these little kind of competitions. Well, you looked at the geography book, and it literally was entirely about creating a sustainable world. It was essentially a propaganda course on the environment and about the need. And literally, I just remember this picture of a white polar bear and this warning sign, alarm. Do you know that by the time you finish school, there might not be white polar bears? And you can imagine impressionable young kids, kids like bears, like to play with everything else, all of a sudden realizing that their favorite animal was going to become extinct. And you read through the whole book, and it really was like a caricature. It was somebody who was probably smoking some kind of drug and decided that now is a good time to let out all their prejudices under the heading of a geography lesson. And at that point I began to look at other geography books, and I realized that this wasn't just a one-off thing, but that geography had become entirely captured by the sustainability agenda, where everything was, rivers, mountains, everything else was being taught from that point of view. And you then look at history, and I remember history is my big love in life, reading history books that are now available for young people. And you learn about how, the Victorian age wasn't an age when all these incredible things happened. It was a century of pollution, where essentially, British society polluted the world and created so much problems for the younger generation. And so in a sense, what I'm really getting at is, I really felt this very strongly, because as somebody who was born in Hungary during the Stalinist era, and having to read the kind of Stalinist texts, where you had tractors with smiling workers and red flags, being shoved down your throat, I really felt that this was a variation of the same kind of project. So you have a situation where, if you have the social engineering element, being promoted in that kind of a way, then what you have is a situation where, in a sense, the educational needs of children become very much secondary and become limited by that. Now, just to end on, I would say that what has happened in the most recent period is that the social engineering element has acquired an increasingly obsessive tone. It's become almost like a form of zealous ideology that is promoted, and that is why you have a situation where, for example, you could have such a focus on issues to do with sexuality, with sex, for example, transgenderism. That is why you have such a focus on race and teaching young people about white fragility and their white privilege. Because at a certain point, you invite every campaigning group, anybody with an agenda, to regard the classroom as a safe space where they can promote their ideas without any opposition. Because a 13-year-old girl or a 13-year-old boy is not in a position to argue against white fragility. They're not in a position to say, hey man, I'm not really that fragile as you make me out to be. And if they do, they know that they're going to be marginalized and there's going to be very few people that will defend them. So basically, the classroom has become this safe space for this ideological crusade, and spouted out from a number of different quarters. And that's really where we are at the moment. And that's got two consequences. The first consequence is, and this is deeply disturbing, is that it has the effect of creating a psychic distance between children and their parents. What schooling does is it self-consciously tries to estrange young kids from their parents and their grandparents and their community. They learn a very simple lesson, which is that their parents don't get it. The parents don't get it. The teachers do, but the parents don't get it. They learn that their parents are so old-fashioned that they cannot understand their emotions in the way that the teacher or the therapist, whoever is around, does. So you create this big distance. And this is almost done secretly. Parents are not aware of what's going on until their child comes home one day and they have the surprise of their life. And you can guess what form that would take at any one time. The second consequence of this, something that is deeply troubling, is that if you socialize children in that way, you create a circumstance where young people become subject to a permanent identity crisis. Young people who don't know where they come from, young people who've been subjected to all these different agendas, but who have been detached from their past and from their community, find it very difficult to know who they are, what their identity is. I mean, the most extreme form of this is the transgender issue, where you're told you might not be a girl, you might think you're a girl, but who knows, 4 years from now you might discover you're something else. And when you have this kind of sense of lack of clarity about who you are and what you're going to become, it creates what is genuinely an identity crisis, where you're not really sure what you are, and therefore you become subject to all kinds of pressures in your life. And you lack, as a result of that, you simply lack the confidence and the self-belief to make your way in the world. And I think one of the consequences of that we find is that there's a certain confusion and disorientation among the younger generation, which is quite striking, and it's something that we have to really take very, very seriously, because we do depend upon the younger generation to take over and run this world fairly shortly. So this is, in a sense, the main complications that we really end up with. And it seems to me that one of our jobs, one of our tasks, one of our challenges is to get to the point where we discuss this problem of education in a laid-back, intellectually informed, and smart way, so that people can see that the future of our society is being gradually undone and compromised by the inability of adult society to take schooling seriously, by the obsession of adult society to try to solve its own problems on the back of children. And as a result of which, what happens is young people really become hostages to our own adult confusion. Thank you.